here are some books for your sad girl summer. Hi, I'm Colleen Delaney. If you're new here, I talk about books and writing. In the description, I have links to everything you might need, my newsletter, my books. Today, we're going to talk about books that make me sob. I've heard the phrase sad girl summer often. I feel like for over a decade. And obviously, you don't have to identify as a girl to cry your face off to these books, but I thought it might be kind of fun to put together a collection of books that made me cry really hard. So these aren't books that just made me tear up. These are books that made me sob. And if you've been following along for a while, I do cry kind of easily, but I would say I don't sob hysterically very easily. And every book on this list was a sob hysterically. Okay, let's get going. And I do have 2 books on this list that I feel like everybody knows make you sob hysterically, but I stopped it there. I didn't add some more that I feel like everybody knows, but I did put 2. We're gonna start with a book that made me cry so hard I felt physically ill, and that's Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. Yes, the cover's not very summery. So it's about a woman named Franny who is on an expedition from the Arctic to Antarctica following the last migration of the Arctic terns, because we're in the near future, but there's a mass extinction going on of animals, insects, pretty much all living creatures other than humans. And you're following Franny in the present when she's on this expedition, but you're also exploring her past. She's an ornithologist, and she has some big secrets in her past that have kind of affected her greatly. When you find out what the big secret is, I'm not lying when I say for the last 50-ish pages of this book, I was crying so hard I couldn't breathe a little bit. And my child at the time, who I think was 9 when I read this, came in, was like, Mom, I think you need to stop reading that book. But it's so beautifully written. Charlotte McConaughey is an amazing writer. I keep Googling to see if she's anything new come out, because this plus Once There Were Wolves, I think, are 2 of my favorite books of all time. They're just so well written. But you do really read this if you just want to wallow in hopelessness. And then other really, really sad stuff happens. Next, I'm just going to quickly touch on one everybody knows about, and that is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. It's true. It will make you cry so hard. I think even more so if you've read the Iliad, because there's some throwaway lines in there that if you've read the Iliad, you're like, oh, when you know what's going to come. It's the story of Achilles and Patroclus, who have been for many years discussed by classicists whether or not they were actually gay. And one of my best friends is a classics professor, and she says, yes, they were. So just get over it. They were. So you're welcome. You're allowed to believe that. She's the smartest classicist I know. And obviously their love story is a tragedy. If you're familiar with the Trojan War or Achilles or what happens, this is a tragedy, but it's a beautiful tragedy. And the reason it's such a tragedy is because you start so many years before the Trojan War. So you really get to know them for so long before the tragedy hits, which always makes it more heart-wrenching. Let's switch back to some you maybe haven't heard of, and we'll go with No Two Persons by Erica Bauermeister. This is an interesting pick for me to put in here, because this is basically, I think it's 9 short stories. It's about a woman named Alice who writes a book. And the first chapter is about her writing the book. And then every other chapter is about someone who reads the book and how it affects their life. And there's one story in here in particular that made me ugly cry for such a long time. And I think it's the second to last story. I'm going to just double check. It's the third to last story. And it is so beautiful and so sad and so sad. It's called Northeastern California 2017. And it's just, oh God, it made me cry so hard. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but I think part of what made it so sad is when you have books come into your life when you're just going through a really, really horrible time, and how that book might help or hinder you, and how that book becomes kind of always tied to that horrible time. And that's what that's about. Next, I have The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry by Gabrielle Zevin, which I did not pick this up thinking it would make me so sad. It's a contemporary fiction, and it's about this island, and mostly it's about AJ Fikry, who owns an independent bookstore, and he's widowed kind of young, and about the book opens with a woman basically like leaving him her child, someone he's never met before, and being like, can you please raise this child? And he decides to, but you also follow the relationships he has with like people who are like his salespeople from publishing companies, and like his brother-in-law and sister-in-law and all these people on the island. And you follow him kind of through his early widowerhood to many, many years later. And it has a very sad turn that I don't want to spoil for you, but it made me cry so hard. And this one page in particular made me cry so hard that I read it out loud to my husband while I was sobbing, and he was like, I think I need more context of the book. So he didn't get it, but it's very sad. Let's go with another one that most people know is very sad, and that's The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I've talked about Taylor Jenkins Reid a lot on this channel, and how every time I go to read one of her books, I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna like this. And I was kind of like, ugh. I'm not super into old Hollywood. I'm like, a woman who gets married 7 times, am I gonna like this? And then I read this book, and the ending is so beautiful, and the way she frames her life with these 7 husbands was fantastic. And it's not really like a twist, because you know what's happening pretty early on in the book, but what the book's actually about is gorgeous. And the ending is extremely sad. And I wouldn't say the end is very sad, because you're gonna read this and be like, oh, I didn't really think that was that sad, because it could be construed as sad. But you know, if you've read this, you know what part I'm talking about is so unbelievably sad. The next book I'm going to talk about, I don't have a copy of, and I did for a very long time at my parents' house, because this is a book that I read in the year 2000. So I read this book 24 years ago, and I still consider it to be one of the saddest books I've ever read, and that's In the Time of the Butterflies by Julia Alvarez. Part of what makes this book so incredibly sad is it's based on real people, the Mirabal sisters, who became sort of like revolutionary heroes through their deaths in the Dominican Republic in like the 50s and 60s. And they're part of like an underground resistance. But they're also like young women with young children and in love with their spouses and love each other so much. And so part of that it just it did such an amazing job at humanizing these people who became sort of like almost like mythological figures in the revolution in the Dominican Republic. But it was so sad. And I read it for school. I went to a Catholic high school, which I'm sure I've talked about before. But so I had to take theology when I was a senior. And we read this in our theology class. I can't even remember why, like how my teacher connected to it. Because there was a class you could take that was like a peace and justice class that was mostly about like how to sort of, this is going to get so weird, but like how to sort of like take your faith and make the world better through it. And I was not in that class. I was in a different theology class, and maybe we were reading it because everyone did. I can't remember, but it was one of those, it was probably the first book I ever read for school that made me cry really hard. And I just felt so connected to these historical women through fiction. Their stories also really, really interesting. If you don't know it, I would recommend like going on a deep dive if you don't want to read the entire book. Like I would listen to a podcast, Stuff You Missed in History class did an episode on them a long time ago, probably in like 2019, that was really good. And you could also just read some news articles about them. Next, I have a book I read relatively recently, and that's Mame by Jessica George. This is a contemporary fiction about Maddie, who lives in London, but she is the daughter of Ghanaian immigrants, and she doesn't feel like 100% belonging in either place. When she goes to Ghana, she's like the girl who's grown up in Britain. And when she is in London, she's like the girl whose parents are immigrants. It's kind of about a quarter life crisis. So she's 25, and she's been the sole caretaker of her father who has Parkinson's for a very long time because her mom lives in Ghana. And her mom moves back and says, I'll take care of him. You should be a young adult. And she gets an apartment and tries to kind of figure out her life. And I thought this book did such a good job kind of like describing what it feels like to be in your 20s. And what life looks like as a 20-year-old, and how like really hard stuff can happen when you're in your 20s. And yeah, it made me cry really hard. The end didn't make me cry. It was the middle. The middle is so sad. Okay, so if you haven't read The Book of Longings by Sue Kidd and you want to really cry for probably 30 minutes after you finish it, I'd recommend it. This is a fictionalized, it's kind of like a mythology retelling. It depends on how you feel about Christianity. Book about if Jesus had been married to kind of like a progressive woman named Anna. And it's mostly about what it was like to be a Jewish woman around the turn of the millennium. And what I really, really liked about this book, as Sue Monk Kidd said, she took all the divinity out of it and just had it be that Jesus was like a kind of like a social justice philosopher at the time period. If you're familiar with Christianity, you know how it ends. So you know it's quite sad, but it's also very, very beautifully written. And I really like ancient history, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it, the discussion of what life would have looked like for a woman in that time period living in Judea, being married to a man who's not getting along with the Roman Empire or the Jewish leaders in their community. So I thought it was very, very well written and did make me cry for a long time. And I'll just say, one of my cousins who is a devout Catholic loved this book, so I wouldn't necessarily shy away from it if you're worried that it's going to conflict with your religious beliefs. Okay, so next we have another book that I don't have with me. I owned this book, and I think I lent it to one of my neighbors because I can't find it. But it's called The Terrible by Yrsa Daley Ward, and it's a story written in like poem format. It's not rhyming, so it's like prosy poetry. And it's a memoir of a woman who, this will just give you a little insight. She eventually becomes a model, but it's a lot about what her life looks like as a child with like her mom's bad boyfriends and like how she kind of gets moved around constantly. And she gets like, you know, some stigma attached to her. She's a Black woman / girl living in England. And she's younger than me, but I would say probably like 10 years younger than me. So it's like the 90s, the early 2000s when the story's taking place. And it made me very sad just because she had a very rough, realistic upbringing. It wasn't like anything super unrealistic happened to her or like, oh my gosh, that never happens to anyone. And it was just very sad. So if you read the title of this and you've been counting along, I said 13 books for Sad Girl Summer. And I'm going to be honest, the last 3 are by the same author. They're by Alice Hoffman, and I just had to because honestly, I was gonna put only one of her books on. Not all of her books make me sob. So I was gonna pick one, and then I just decided I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna tell you the 3 that made me cry really hard. I tear up during most of them, but these 3 made me sob. The first is one I don't have anymore because I took it on vacation to Arizona a long time ago. I was pregnant with my twins, who are 6.5. So, like 7 years ago. And we lost a bag. And I think my book was in that bag. Or maybe it got ruined from like the weather there. I can't remember. But it is The Dove Keepers. And that book will break your heart. But honestly, when I read that book, I was like, that immediately became one of my favorite books. And it was the first book I read by Alice Hoffman outside of the Practical Magic series. And I didn't get it because it was by Alice Hoffman. I got it because it sounded good, and it really made me fall in love with her and start reading her books that were not in the Practical Magic series, which ended up being a really good idea because I adore her books. Nothing wrong with the Practical Magic series, but I really like her other books. If you are familiar with Roman or Judean history, it's about Masada, which was a historical event I did actually know a little bit about beforehand, but didn't know enough. So you follow 3 women, I think, maybe 4 women who live in Masada, which is a town in Judea that, for the end of the book, holds out against the Romans for months. And I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end, but you might want to... Actually, I am going to give you a little bit of a spoiler, so jump ahead 15 seconds. This is historically known because instead of becoming enslaved, every single person in this town killed themselves. So it's very sad. And like children, every single person. And so you follow, spoiler over, you follow these women from way before this big something happens with the Romans and until the end. And it's very beautiful and very sad and just one of those books that really stays with you for a long period of time. Or like me, makes you completely fall in love with an author who's going to become one of your favorite authors now. Next, we're going to talk about The Ice Queen by Alice Hoffman, which you might be thinking, I don't want to read a book about ice in the summer. That's not why it's called that. So in The Ice Queen, you have a woman who, she's like going through a really, really hard time in her life. She makes a wish that she'll be struck by lightning, thinking it will kill her. And she is struck by lightning, but it doesn't kill her. And then you follow her, how her life changes. The weird thing about this book is this is a short book. Let me see how many pages it is. 211 pages. And for the first 50, I was like, I am not into this book. What is happening? I love Alice Hoffman. And then from page 100 to the end, I think I was crying the entire time because it becomes about something else. So you think this is going to be a book about this woman who gets struck by lightning and then this relationship she has with this man who's also been struck by lightning. But that's kind of what it happens. But then the second half of the book is about something completely different. And I will say, if you have like siblings, it's very much about a sibling relationship that sort of breaks your heart. And you'll be like, I need to call my siblings when you're reading this, because that's exactly what I thought. Through the tears. And then the last book I have is Skylight Confessions by Alice Hoffman, which I read recently and reviewed recently on my channel. This book, the beginning is what's so sad. You're just following, Alice Hoffman does setting as a character so well. So in this one, you're following kind of like a house, this like glass house, and the people who live there. And in particular, you follow this, she's a girl when it starts, who kind of traps, she doesn't trap him. You follow this girl who's, I think she's 17 when it starts, and her father has just died, and she gets this thought like the next man she sees is the man she's going to fall in love with and marry. And then she sees a man and she sort of is just like, that's it. And then you follow her realizing that maybe that wasn't the man for her, and now this is what her life is, and this is what her life's going to look like. And you follow past generations, so the story doesn't stay just with her. You follow other people in her family and other people attached to her family in the house that they live in through the years. And it's just one of those books that you could read it in a day. You'll cry a lot in the first half, but by the end, you'll feel kind of like uplifted. I think that's the best way to put it. I hope you all enjoyed this list of sad books. There are obviously more. There are so many more. I could have made this a 45 book list, and that probably wouldn't even cover all the books that made me cry. I mean, I didn't even touch my young adult lit class I had to take for library science, which I remember saying to my husband, who he was not my husband at the time, this class is so emotionally exhausting because everything we're reading is so sad. And this is like my schoolwork that is making me cry. I didn't even go into that. I didn't put Addie LaRue on this list, which I can see right here, which is another one that'll make you cry. Electra made me cry. I'm a crier. A lot of these books made me cry. Juliette Marillier. I am a crier. But I hope that out of those 13, you found something that will, break your heart this summer if you want that to happen. If you're still here, thanks for hanging out for so long. Put in the comments your favorite sad book that you've ever read that's just made snot run down your face. Or if you want to let me know you've made it this far without writing a word, give me a crying emoji. Seems appropriate. And as always, I hope you're in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. I'll see you soon.